So a friend of mine just sent me this link, and it's an announcement from Pioneer. The title is Pioneer Announces Transfer of Cycle Sport Business. So strange for a few reasons. What my friend seems to believe, they're using the term transfer. I'm a little less concerned about the word transfer in this instance because it's Pioneer making the announcement. So normally you would use the term, Shimano acquires Pioneer's cycling business. Maybe Shimano is going to do that announcement in that way. We'll see. His thought might be that it almost feels like a legal transfer, meaning like maybe Pioneer infringed in patents of Shimano. So what's really interesting is Shimano's current power meter design is not their one and only. They have, I would at least estimate 20 or 30 patents prior to that one for various different designs, weird cranks. They had actually some pedal designs. They have e-bike designs, a lot of e-bike designs. They have a huge number of e-bike designs right up until current. But this is kind of interesting to me for a couple of notable reasons. So I'll get into in a couple of minutes the whole Dura-Ace debacle, but it's interesting from a perspective that I'd heard rumors that Pioneer wasn't doing as well as they thought this cycling business would have been expected. It's one of these things that most of these companies are privately or semi-privately owned, and it's really, really hard to get sales data. So, people look at power meters and it can be fairly interesting. They look at a power meter and they're like, okay, well, hold on. This is, $30 of electronics, maybe optimized, it's $12 of electronics, a bunch of firmware that, you have to hire a firmware guy, but like a guy can do that in kind of about 6 months if the hardware's working. And strain gauges, like if you're ordering volume strain gauges, they're like a few dollars. And this is exactly why there have been so many Kickstarters, because people look at those and they total that up and they're like, this should be $25. A power meter should be $25 and maybe 2x for their profit. Yeah, no. Realistically, like it costs a lot. If you want to hire someone to install, like commercially install and wire a single strain gauge, the usual minimum is like a minimum 4 hours and $150 an hour. With an average estimate that every strain, you get one strain gauge installed per hour. They do not guarantee results. They do not guarantee the accuracy. You tell them that you want to measure strain in some direction. They will offer several solutions. You pick it, and it's all on you. And that's how the professional strain gauging industry works. Now, on the other end is, somewhere on the spectrum is the transducer side of things. So if you go and get a North American built load cell that you've had individually calibrated, you're kind of looking at about $1,000. Why? They do the design, they analyze the design, they test, and they build it, then they instrument it, then they do a whole bunch of compensations. They do thermal compensation, so they use special resistors to kind of mimic what an active system would do with measuring, so that they tune resistors. They may tune for the gauge factor change over temperature and the modulus change of the material over temperature, and they'll have resistors that have to be like manually balanced. when you get into volume stuff that comes out of China, they kind of do this on bulk, and they might claim 1% full scale nonlinearity or something, but that's primarily a function of the material. So if you understand that, like, people have been diving for like $25 power meters, but you can't realistically, in a controlled environment, install string gauges in mass. You can do it way less than $100. But you can't do that and calibrate. And then with the complexity of the crank arms, I was the first person to do several things with power meters. I was the first person to make a functional carbon fiber power meter that I know of. It's on my original Keith Hack blog. It was a SRAM S900. I still own it. It's in a closet over there. But it was the first, and it had some more thermal stuff, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. And that was before I joined Four Eyes, so I can certainly easily talk about it. But it was years before Stages ever attempted it. And in fact, there's a couple aspects of its design that still would actually beat out some of the Stages stuff, if I change some of the firmware and electronics, but it just lives in a box as a historic piece for me now. So I did that first. If you look up my patents, I was the first to use corrective methods, especially designed around factorial experiments for power meters. So I had my original 8-gauge design using 2 Wheatstone bridges. That's out there. It's patented. It's owned by a company. And then when we realized all the Shimano stuff, we were the first to implement another compensation. So we just expanded, and this is also in their next patent. We expanded the compensation, and it worked pretty well. And if you actually, my understanding of Shimano is when they originally started on the FC9000, it was very close to Stages, meaning just a bend arrangement. And that's fine. But there was inherent limitations in that. There's, and to this day, on a physically asymmetric left arm, even though a lot of reviewers can't find it, like, I can go out and I can reproducibly create error in like a 9000 or 9100 arm. I can put me on a bike and then someone else on a bike with pedals, with a spider and another one, and I can easily show commercial off the shelf, just grab it off the shelf, no hand tuning, it's going to be off. And I've done this multiple times, and it's consistently off. And it's consistently off, well, inconsistently off, but it is off. And on average for me, it'll be like 6% low, and for someone else, it varies. It on the riding style, on a whole bunch of things. So, shortly after I came up with using, multiple corrective methods, it was interesting to see that Shimano had filed for a patent using multiple corrective methods too. But they tweak things, and the crux of their patent is that instead of having a bend gauge where they're parallel, they twist at one of their gauges. And that twist was, it seems like, I've never really fully investigated it because I actually haven't had a chance to disassemble one of them, that it can only correct so much, and then they used all the other gauges in it as corrective, just like the previous company I worked for was doing in previous company's patents. So now we get to Pioneer being acquired by Shimano, and what doesn't make sense here is they never thought of automatically correcting until their third generation product. They had like an axial setup in it. They had 2 bend and 1 in a Poisson arrangement in the center. And it was for their cycling vector stuff. they didn't use it, and I can prove it. Like if you actually cut one of these open and you cut that center strain gauge so it doesn't read properly, or you replace it with dummy resistors, your power measurements don't actually change. And that was their first and their second generation product. In fact, they produced a video where you can clearly see several brands, including one I worked for, a product in the background disassembled. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty common. Everyone disassembles everyone else's stuff. Everyone buys their stuff, disassembles it to figure out how it works if they have an edge on you. The number of competitor power meters I've disassembled over the years is huge. But this leads to something really weird. And I'm going to say, blind leading the blind? Because Shimano's tech is actually way more advanced, even though it still doesn't work especially on the drive side. It probably works fine like another company's tech on the left side, but it doesn't work quite on the right side because of all this weird coupling that is like positionally dependent, and that was their design choice that they never properly explored inside. But Pioneer are years behind that. They were years behind that. They had no idea of the coupling effect. There was no idea, like, I mean, third generation before they tried to correct for axial. So, I mean, this leads some credence to my friend's theory that this may have been a more of a legal play than, you know, an acquisition, because it's either that or they've stumbled into that something that maybe Pioneer hasn't released yet, actually, or they've attempted to patent. But I follow a lot of these companies, and I haven't seen any new patents from Pioneer. So, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, at least from the perspective of why they would do it. Maybe it was just Pioneer's gotten sick of, like, the lack of profitability. Because, you know, you were not dealing with, you know, hundreds of thousands of units. A Samsung Galaxy Fold, considered a huge flop at 550,000 units sold globally. It was like, sorry, what? You sold 500,000 units and it's a flop? And that's the thing. Yeah, like when things are so ubiquitous, when the market size is so absolutely huge, that you're measuring your success and failures in hundreds of thousands of units. But cycling companies, they don't operate on hundreds of thousands of units. And I did a blog post on my old blog years ago showing how to try and back out numbers for industries when you have little information. And I used product recalls, and currently I'm doing that same thing now with the Maelstrom controller to estimate how many indoor cyclists, how many indoor subscribers, how many smart trainers, how many regular trainers are being sold. And I come at it from, 5 different ways. You come in from one way, you come in from another way, and you come in from another way, and you kind of get a ball of how big the market is. But then when you tell someone else that, like, hey, cost of goods is $100 for something, probably assembly, calibration, everything, $150 to make a power meter. Then you have your materials cost, so your crank arm or your whatever on top of that, and then you have your marketing costs. And like that's been my biggest startup learning experience is marketing cost. It costs a lot. It is huge. In some cases, it's equivalent or more than your cost of goods. The amount of money and effort to sell something can cost more than your product. Maybe it probably doesn't for Samsung and Apple's of the world, but when you're trying to reach that audience, they talk about the value of organic marketing, and not to abuse it, to be very respectful of it. But until I actually figured out how much a Google ad click costs, how much a Facebook ad click costs, changes things. So, maybe Pioneer was selling 10,000 units of these a year. I mean, and that will probably be a high side estimate. You look at how much it costs to employ engineer, and they had their video indicates some really high end gear. So they weren't stingy with the money that they were spending. They really went all out. They had fixtures and rigs in their videos that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'd be surprised if their company had actually recouped their developmental, or that division, I should say, has recouped that developmental cost. But then it doesn't make sense for Shimano to acquire it unless they saw some value in it, or that Pioneer was going to just mothball it anyway, and they sold it for a song, and Shimano went, hey, whatever. Weird times. We've seen several companies now, two within the last year. Quark acquired PowerTap, and Pioneer is now acquired by Shimano. So lots of weird happenings in this year. I'd be surprised if we didn't see a few more in the next year or so. Shimano doubling down on their power meters, especially on sponsorship. So many, every team was sponsored with an inaccurate power meter this year. So that was, humorous, but, it's sponsors. Unless you, are risking injury to people, they ride what they're sponsored. But yeah, it's weird times, weird acquisition. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's no real patent value there. They've got a few patents, but there's no real patent value there above Shimano's. They're not an exceedingly profitable division. They don't have any major aspect that is more valuable. Pioneer acquired a bike fit company a few years that had their own power meter force vectoring technology. Their existing power meter, if they redesign the crank arm, would then be high accuracy and then can do force vector analysis. So, yeah, the only thing I can see is it's either, like my friend suggested, legal, or do you want to buy us for $5? Because otherwise we're going to mothball the whole thing. But it's assets. That's the interesting thing. It's just assets. So, presumably everyone who had a job there is probably gone. With that, hoping to get back to doing some videos again. Been exceedingly busy, then got sick with the worst cold, which is, no one wants to see that on camera. Barely. So, with that, weird times in the cycling industry, and the next year, it's going to get weirder.